The city at night. From a distance, it's a beautiful, sprawling tapestry of light. But look closer. The night hides many secrets, concealing truths we'd rather not face. Down on the ground, there are roads that look empty, stretching into the unknown. There are houses that seem peaceful, their windows glowing like warm, watchful eyes. We tell ourselves we're safe, trusting the quiet, but that's a mistake. Because behind the silence, danger often waits, patient and unseen. Tonight, we pull back the curtain on that false security. We bring you 3 chilling true stories, each a stark reminder of what can happen when you let your guard down. These are stories where ordinary nights turned into unforgettable nightmares, and each one will remind you of a terrifying truth. Not everyone is who they seem to be. It was just after midnight, in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood in the heart of the Midwest. The kind of place that prided itself on its safety, its neatly manicured lawns, and the comforting illusion that nothing truly bad could ever happen here. It was a community built on trust, where neighbors exchanged pleasantries over white picket fences and doors were often left unlocked. The loudest sound on a typical night was the gentle hum of the last few cars on the distant highway, a lullaby for a town that slept soundly, convinced of its own immunity. But on this particular night in early autumn, as a crisp chill settled in the air and leaves skittered across empty sidewalks, that comforting silence was about to be shattered. It wouldn't be broken by a scream or an alarm, but by something far more sinister. A fire that burned without a sound. Neighbors, woken not by noise but by that eerie, flickering orange glow against their own bedroom walls, would later describe the scene as deeply unsettling. It was unnervingly quiet. There was no explosion, no shouting. It was as if the house at the end of the cul-de-sac had simply decided to consume itself silently from the inside out. The flames, once they took hold, were voracious. They licked up the siding, devoured the curtains, and turned a lifetime of memories into ash and smoke in a terrifyingly short amount of time. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. This was no tragic accident. Fire marshals would quickly rule out the usual suspects. No grease fire in the kitchen, no faulty wiring in the walls, not a single spark from a natural cause. The evidence was undeniable, pointing to a horrifying conclusion. Someone had stood in the dark, watched the house, and intentionally set it ablaze. This wasn't just a fire, it was an attack. And inside that burning house was a young woman named Sarah Miller. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand Sarah. She was 27 years old, a dedicated nurse at the local hospital. Her life revolved around caring for others during grueling 12-hour shifts. Her friends and co-workers would describe her as the kindest person they knew, someone with a gentle soul, but also intensely private. She built walls around her personal life, not out of unfriendliness, but perhaps out of a deep-seated need for safety. She lived alone in the small house her parents had left her, and while she cherished her independence, the long, quiet evenings could feel isolating after the constant chaos of the hospital. On the surface, she was content. But underneath, a quiet loneliness had begun to take root. It was this vulnerability that led her to try online dating. And just weeks before the fire, for the first time in years, she started opening up. She excitedly told her co-workers about a new man she'd met. The change was noticeable. The guarded Private Sarah was suddenly beaming, her eyes bright with a hope her friends hadn't seen in a long time. After years of keeping everyone at arm's length, she was finally letting someone in. His name was Ethan. Sarah met Ethan on a popular dating app, the kind millions of people use every day to search for connection. At first, their conversations were easy and familiar. They talked about their favorite movies, the music they grew up with, and their dreams for the future. They fell into a comfortable rhythm of late-night chats that stretched into the early hours of the morning. But soon, the dynamic began to shift. Ethan wasn't just charming, he was intoxicatingly so. He seemed to know exactly what Sarah wanted to hear, mirroring her hopes and insecurities with uncanny precision. He was intense, showering her with constant attention and affection. Looking back, her friends would say he seemed almost too perfect, like a character written specifically for her. Sarah, who had been so cautious for so long, fell for him hard and fast. Her friends at the hospital noticed the change immediately. The constant buzzing of her phone became the soundtrack to their coffee breaks. Within a few weeks, her life began to revolve around Ethan. She started canceling their weekly dinner plans, offering vague apologies while her eyes were glued to her phone. She was staying up all night talking to him, coming into her demanding job exhausted but euphoric. She was pulling away, retreating into the perfect world Ethan had built for her. When her friends gently voiced their concerns, asking when they would finally get to meet this amazing man, Sarah would get defensive. She assured them that Ethan was real, that his job was just demanding. He was even planning to move to her town, she'd say, to finally be with her. But every time a plan was made, Ethan would cancel at the last minute. A sudden work emergency, a family crisis, a car that mysteriously broke down. There was always an excuse, always a reason that kept him conveniently out of sight, a perfect phantom in her phone. Which brings us back to the night of the fire. Sarah had just finished a grueling shift at the hospital. She was tired, but likely looking forward to getting home, kicking off her shoes, and losing herself in another conversation with Ethan. A neighbor, out for a late-night cigarette, saw her car pull into the driveway at around 11:30 p.m. They watched her carry a single bag of groceries inside, the porch light clicking off behind her. It was a perfectly ordinary end to a perfectly ordinary day. The house went dark, and the street fell silent once more. But in the single hour that followed, something terrible happened. Just after 12:30 a.m., the first 911 call came in. By the time fire crews arrived, the blaze was an inferno. The roof was beginning to groan and sag, and the home was collapsing in on itself. After hours of battling the flames, they were finally able to enter the smoldering ruins, and it was in the wreckage that they made the first grim discovery. They found Sarah Miller. But the details of the scene were immediately chilling to the seasoned investigators. Sarah wasn't found in her bedroom, or near a window, or by a door where someone trying to escape a fire would be. She was found in the basement. And the forensic team confirmed their worst fears. The fire had been started down there with a powerful accelerant, and she wasn't alone. Lying just a few feet from her in the charred debris was a second body. A man. The scene was a confusing, horrific puzzle. Who was this person? A burglar she had surprised? A secret boyfriend no one knew about? The questions hung heavy in the smoke-filled air. The initial investigation into his identity hit a wall. The man had been carrying no wallet, no keys, no phone. His clothes were burned beyond recognition. He was a ghost, a John Doe who had died in the fire he likely started. But in forensic science, there are always traces left behind. A partial fingerprint, lifted from a non-porous surface in the basement that had miraculously survived the heat, was run through the national database. And soon, the ghost had a name. The man in the basement was Ethan. He was the man Sarah had fallen for, the man she thought was moving to town to be with her. Except Ethan was a complete fabrication, a carefully constructed mask. The man's real name was Daniel Harris, a 42-year-old from a neighboring state. And his file painted a terrifying picture. Daniel had a long and documented history of predatory behavior, multiple restraining orders filed against him by other women, and prior convictions for stalking, harassment, and breaking and entering. He was a digital predator who used the anonymity of the internet as his hunting ground. He would create elaborate fake profiles, using stolen photos and fabricated life stories to find and groom his victims. He was an expert at emotional manipulation, luring lonely or vulnerable women into his web before his behavior inevitably turned obsessive and dangerous. Investigators believe that on that night, Daniel, perhaps tired of being kept at a digital distance, showed up at Sarah's house unannounced. When she rejected him, his fantasy shattered, and his obsession turned to rage. He attacked her, dragged her to the basement, and set the fire to destroy the evidence. never intending to be caught in his own trap. The woman who was so careful with her heart had unknowingly opened it to a monster. And in the end, Sarah Miller became his final victim. There's a unique kind of loneliness that settles in on a highway after midnight. The world shrinks to just the bubble of your headlights, a solitary beam cutting through the immense darkness. You're adrift on an endless stretch of blacktop, with mountains looming on either side like sleeping giants. The silence out there is different too. It's not empty. It feels heavy, pressing in, so thick you could almost touch it. Anyone who spends enough time on these desolate roads has a story. Truckers and late-night travelers trade tales of phantom lights or figures that appear and vanish on the roadside. Most are just tricks of a tired mind, but some stories feel more real. And one particular account from the early 2000s still chills anyone who hears it. Because the terror didn't just happen on the road. On a frigid February night in Colorado, a 29-year-old man named Michael Turner was making the long drive home after a weekend with his parents. It was a grueling route, one that snaked through pitch-black mountain passes and along narrow, winding roads. For long stretches, civilization vanished completely. No houses, no lights, and most unnervingly, no cell signal. Out there, if something went wrong, you were completely on your own. Michael was used to the solitude of the drive. It wasn't his first time navigating this ribbon of asphalt in the dark. He usually found a certain peace in it, but that night, the peace wasn't there. An unsettling feeling had been creeping up on him. Something just felt off. He pulled into a small, isolated gas station, its fluorescent lights a lonely beacon in the oppressive dark. As the pump clicked, he noticed another car parked on the far, poorly lit side of the station. Its headlights were off, but he could hear the low, steady hum of the engine. A silhouette was visible in the driver's seat, perfectly still. Michael tried to shrug it off. People rest. He filled his tank, paid at the pump, and left, eager to be home. About 20 minutes later, Michael glanced at his rearview mirror, and there it was, a pair of headlights appearing out of the void. They weren't aggressively close, but they weren't falling back either. They just hung there, a steady, watchful presence. He took a winding turn, expecting them to disappear. They didn't. He drove another 5 miles. They were still there. At first, he dismissed it as a coincidence, another late-night traveler. But as the miles stretched on, and those 2 points of light remained fixed in his mirror, a cold knot of dread began to form. But then, something strange happened. The road was a black ribbon twisting through the mountains, and Michael Hennessy was the only one on it, or so he thought. That's when he first noticed them in his rearview mirror, a pair of headlights, cutting through the oppressive darkness behind him. At first it was a comfort, a silent companion on a lonely stretch of highway, but the comfort soon began to fade. Every time Michael slowed down, the car slowed too. He'd tap his brakes, a gentle test, and the headlights behind him would immediately soften their glare, maintaining the exact same distance. Every time he sped up, the car matched his speed. He'd press the accelerator, pushing the speed limit, and the engine behind him would roar in perfect, unnerving sync. It wasn't just following, it was mirroring him, a shadow that refused to be shaken. But it never tried to pass. There were straightaways, passing lanes, but the car just hung back, a persistent, silent observer. The minutes stretched into an eternity, each one marked by that steady, unwavering glow. For nearly an hour, those headlights followed. The initial annoyance had long since curdled into a cold, creeping dread. Michael's unease grew, knotting in his stomach. Who was this person? What did they want? The isolation of the mountain pass pressed in on him. He glanced at the rear-view mirror, a nervous habit he'd now cemented. The twin beams were there. He looked back at the road ahead, then back to the mirror again. Then, without warning, the car's headlights went off. Total darkness. For a moment he felt a wave of relief, but it was instantly replaced by a new, sharper fear. Where did they go? A car doesn't just vanish. He drove the last few miles with his heart hammering against his ribs, his eyes darting between the road and the empty mirror. Nothing behind him but the empty, endless road. As the first familiar streetlights of his town appeared, a fragile sense of safety began to return. Michael felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to rationalize. By the time Michael reached the outskirts of his town, he convinced himself he was imagining things. It was late. He was tired. Paranoia, nothing more. He pulled into his driveway, the silence of his garage a welcome comfort. But as he got out, he noticed something wrong. His backseat door was unlocked. A cold spike of adrenaline shot through him. Michael always locked his doors. Always. It was an obsession, a ritual he never broke. With a trembling hand, he pulled the handle, and when he opened it, the faint, acrid smell of cigarette smoke filled the air. Michael didn't smoke. He hated the smell. Michael froze. The events on the mountain road came rushing back, no longer a paranoid fantasy, but the prelude to something terribly real. He checked the trunk. Empty. The next morning, after a restless night, a sharp knock on his door startled him. It was his neighbor, her face pale. A car had been found abandoned 2 blocks away, engine still running. Inside was the body of a man, later identified as Thomas Reed, a drifter with a long and violent history of burglary and assault. As the details emerged, the puzzle pieces began to click into place with horrifying clarity. Police pieced the story together. The unlocked door, the smell of smoke. Thomas had likely been hiding in Michael's back seat at the gas station, a silent passenger waiting for the darkest, most isolated stretch of road to attack. But something, or someone, interrupted. The police theorized that the second car, the one that had tailed Michael for an hour, was the reason. That mysterious driver wasn't a threat to Michael. They were a threat to Thomas Reed. The relentless pursuit was a warning, a message to the man in the back seat. I see you, I know you're there. But what is certain is this. Michael had been inches away from being another victim. The police believed that when the trailing headlights vanished, Thomas had bailed out of the car, desperate to escape his own pursuer. Some believe Thomas panicked. Others spin a darker tale, that he wasn't alone, that the second car was an accomplice from a deal gone wrong. But the truth was buried with him that night. Michael was never the same. He never drove alone on mountain roads again. Who was in that other car? A guardian angel? A rival criminal? He would never know. He was saved by a shadow, a ghost on the highway who left behind more questions than answers. And even years later, he admitted that sometimes, while driving at night, he still feels the weight of eyes in his back seat. It's a chilling reminder that on highways after midnight, you never really know if you're alone. And sometimes, the person you should be most afraid of is already in the car with you. In the stillness of the night, most people lock their doors, close their blinds, and surrender to the illusion of safety. They believe these simple barriers are enough to keep the darkness at bay. But what if the real danger isn't a stranger rattling the doorknob? What if the threat isn't trying to break in at all, because it's already closer than you imagine? What if it's someone who is already watching you? Someone who knows the rhythm of your days, when you leave for work, the exact moment you turn off your lights to sleep. Someone who waits patiently in the shadows, studying your every move. The story takes us to a small town in the American Midwest, a place where people didn't always lock their doors, where neighbors waved at each other, and the quiet was part of its charm. A place where nothing bad was supposed to happen, until it did. For weeks, a young woman named Emily felt a subtle, gnawing feeling that something wasn't right, a sense of being watched that she couldn't shake. She lived alone in a modest one-story house on a quiet street. Every night, as she pulled into her driveway after work, she noticed the same thing, a flickering light in the distance. It wasn't random, it seemed to pulse with a strange, deliberate rhythm, a street lamp that seemed almost too perfectly timed, as though it were a signal. At first, she brushed it off as paranoia, an old bulb, faulty wiring. It was easier to believe that than to confront the alternative, but soon the signs began to build. A garden hose left uncoiled on the lawn, the faint scent of unfamiliar cologne in the hallway, small things easily dismissed but adding up. The suburbs are supposed to be safe, a quiet symphony of manicured lawns and predictable routines, where the greatest disturbance is a dog barking at the mailman. For Emily, this illusion of security began to fray at the edges, slowly at first, with things that felt just off. It started with her garbage bins. She found them moved, not knocked over by wind, not rifled through by animals, moved, placed with unnerving precision in the middle of her driveway when she woke up in the morning, a silent, strange pronouncement in the quiet dawn. Then her mailbox, sometimes left slightly open, a metallic mouth agape, though she was certain she had closed it. Small things, things you could explain away, things you could dismiss as forgetfulness. But one night, arriving home late, a cold dread washed over her. Her back gate was unlatched, swinging gently in the breeze. She never, ever left it open. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she scanned the shadows of her own backyard, a place that suddenly felt alien and threatening. Emily told her friends, hoping for reassurance. They laughed it off. "It's probably just kids messing around," they said. "You're letting your imagination get the best of you." But their easy dismissal only made her feel more alone. Emily's gut, a primal instinct she couldn't ignore, told her this was no childish prank. Then came the phone calls. It always started the same way. She'd answer and be met with absolute silence, followed by the sound of breathing, not ragged or heavy, but calm, steady, and terrifyingly patient. She would slam the phone down, her hand trembling. But moments later it would ring again, silence, breathing. The cycle of terror repeated until she learned to just let it ring. One night, as she lay in bed trying to convince herself it was all a coincidence, she heard it. A sound that didn't belong. The unmistakable creak of her back porch. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, each one a hammer blow to the silence. Emily froze, every muscle tensed. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to confirm what her mind was screaming at her. Someone was out there, right outside. Her fingers fumbled with her phone as she dialed 911, whispering her address, terrified the intruder would hear. By the time officers arrived, their flashing lights painting her bedroom walls in strobes of red and blue, there was no one in sight. They searched the yard with powerful flashlights, cutting through the darkness. Nothing. But just as they were leaving, their beams about to click off, one of the officers noticed something odd. By the back door, pressed into the soft dirt of the flower bed, was a perfect shoe print. A man's shoe, size 11. Proof. She wasn't imagining it. The police increased patrols in her neighborhood. For a few weeks the world returned to normal. The calls stopped. Nothing was moved. The silence was a relief, and she started to think, to hope that maybe it was finally over. The fear began to recede, replaced by a fragile sense of peace. Until one night, around 2 a.m., she was jolted awake by a faint metallic click. It was the sound of her back door handle, being slowly, deliberately tested. She held her breath, listening in the suffocating darkness. This time she didn't call, she just waited, paralyzed. The sound stopped, a pause, then the soft thud of footsteps retreating across the porch. When she finally gathered the courage to check the next morning, her stomach churned. She found fresh, wet mud smeared on her doorknob. He had tried to get in. It was clear someone wanted in, and the terror was no longer confined to her home. It escalated. After a late shift, she walked to her car in the near-empty parking garage at work. Tucked under her windshield wiper was a folded piece of paper. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, almost elegant. It contained just 4 words. "I like watching you." Emily panicked. She called the police again, her voice cracking. But with no fingerprints on the note, no suspect, and no security cameras in that section of the garage, there was nothing they could do but file another report. She was on her own. So she did the only thing she could think of to reclaim a sliver of control. She installed her own camera, a small hidden lens aimed squarely at her driveway and back gate. For 2 nights the footage showed nothing but swaying trees and passing headlights. Then on the 3rd night, she caught him. On the grainy black and white recording, time-stamped 1:47 a.m., a man appeared at the edge of her property. Tall, a hood pulled low over his face, obscuring his features in shadow. He stood by her back gate for almost 5 minutes, just staring at her house, perfectly still. A silent, menacing statue in the night. And then, as if he knew he was being watched, he slowly turned his head to face the hidden camera and smiled. A wide, knowing, chilling smile. He wasn't just watching her house. He was watching. The police finally had the evidence they needed, grainy footage from a neighbor's security camera. With this crucial lead, they intensified their presence, patrol cars becoming a constant fixture on the darkened streets. After a tense week, they arrested a 32-year-old man who lived less than 3 blocks away, hidden in plain sight. Under questioning, his story unspooled. He admitted he had been watching Emily for months, learning the rhythm of her life. He knew when she left for work and when she returned. He confessed to testing her doors and windows on multiple occasions, feeling the locks, searching for a weakness, just waiting for the right night to finally step inside. Emily had been right all along. The validation brought a wave of cold relief, but it was poisoned by the terrifying reality of how close he had been. The stalker was caught before he could carry out what he planned. But many victims are not so lucky. It's a stark reminder that the silence outside your home isn't always empty. Sometimes, it's someone waiting, watching, and smiling in the dark. You've just heard 3 chilling true stories. Reminders that even the quietest nights can hide the darkest secrets. If you found these stories unsettling, don't forget to subscribe. And if you know a real story that deserves to be told, share it in the comments below, because sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that really happened.